Well, good morning, class. It's Sunday morning where I am, and I would like to talk to you a little bit about the very beginning of the Gospel of Luke. One of the things we see all throughout Luke's Gospel is a lot of prophecy. And as I've been trying to emphasize, prophecy is not, or at least not just about predicting the future. There is a little bit of that in Luke's Gospel about characters in the Gospel predicting sort of near-term events. But actually, prophecy is much, much more than that. It's really about the interpretation of God's scriptures in the past to, in effect, really determine what God is doing in the present and sort of in the near term. And what I'd like to do briefly is to look at a couple of the Canticles in the very beginning of Luke's Gospel. Now, these are very programmatic, we should say, for the whole Gospel. They're going to lay out themes that we're going to expect to see expounded upon all throughout the Gospel. Now, probably the most important part of the first couple of chapters, the first 2 or 3 chapters of Luke's Gospel, especially the infancy story in chapters 1 and 2, is Jesus coming back as the Davidic king. Now, I'm not going to expound on that one so much. I think you can read through the first couple of chapters carefully in your Lucan readings, and you can see most of what I would want you to see. But what I wanted to call your attention to is the way in which these canticles sort of set the stage for what's going to happen in the whole gospel. Okay, so let's look first at the famous Canticle of Mary, and this is known in the Catholic tradition as the Magnificat. This is found in Luke chapter 146, verse 46. This is after Mary receives her Annunciation, and the text says, "My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. For he has regarded the low estate of his handmaiden, and behold, henceforth all generations will call me blessed. For he who is mighty has done great things for me, and holy is his name, and his mercy is on those who fear him from generation to generation. He has shown the strength with his arm, he has scattered the proud in their conceit, he has put down the mighty from their thrones and exalted the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent empty away. He has helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, as he spoke to our fathers, to Abraham, and to his seed forever." Now, obviously, we could spend a great deal of time expounding the themes in the Magnificat, but what I want to kind of zero in on, first of all, is how Jewish the Magnificat really is. The Magnificat, as those of you may notice, is very close to the song that Hannah, the mother of Samuel, sang way back in 1 Samuel, celebrating, in effect, the birth of her baby, Samuel, who also, was kind of conceived by somewhat miraculous means. So that's the first point. This is a very, very Jewish psalm. It's not jumping immediately to the point that we Gentiles want to hear, which is how God is going to save us. How do we get in on this? Well, no. This is really all about all the things that he promised in the Old Testament. Notice here, this is about helping, first and foremost, what? His servant Israel. That's at the ending here. In remembrance of his mercy. His mercy would, of course, refer to many things that he's done in salvation history. The rescue of Israel from Egypt, the refusal to destroy Israel after the golden calf incident or after the sin of Baal Peor. All of these acts of mercy here are going to be highlighted. As he spoke to our fathers, notice it's familial to Abraham and to his seed forever. So first and foremost, this gospel, this Lucan gospel, has to be about the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel. Luke is a Gentile, but in some ways, the way he writes is the most Jewish, the most focused on God making good on what he promised he would do before. Now, so that's one theme I want to bring out. The other theme I really wanted to call your attention to is this theme of what I call eschatological reversal. Eschatological reversal is basically calling the future world, in effect, topsy-turvy. It's going to be, in many ways, the reverse of this world. The things that are high and mighty and powerful in this world will be made humble and low and needy in the next world. The things in this world that are poor, that are needy, that are hungry, will be made full, mighty, and powerful in the next world. Or as Jesus puts it, the last shall become first, and the first shall become last. This idea of eschatological reversal is a deliberate allusion to many things in the prophets, but of the things we looked at, I would like to remind you of Isaiah 40. Verses 1 through 11, the idea of the great hills, valleys becoming raised up to be made a plain, and the hills becoming low. All this is figurative language to speak of this time of this eschatological reversal, in which things will become topsy-turvy. Okay, this is a very important theme in the Jesus tradition, and Luke is one of the key figures who really expounds it for us. Okay, well, unfortunately, that's all I'm going to say for now about the Magnificat, but there's so much more we could bring out. You know, we could probably do a lesson on each verse if we really wanted to. But I want to call your attention now to the Canticle of Zechariah. Zechariah is, of course, celebrating the birth of his son. This is John the Baptist, and his canticle is also, like Mary's, very Jewish, very based on the deeds of God in the past as sort of filtered down and interpreted through the prophets, and really, in effect, understanding those deeds in the past as they've been interpreted in the present. Zechariah is, in effect, doing his own act of prophecy with this canticle. Okay, he's understanding what God is doing through him and through the birth of this son, John the Baptist. Okay, and let's take a look at this. So, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, for he has visited and redeemed his people. Okay, this theme of visiting, again, is this idea of God sort of coming down from on high. Again, this is a little bit of an eschatological reversal, the high and mighty coming low. Why? To ultimately take those who are low and bring them up. He has raised up a horn of salvation for us, the very Old Testament imagery there of the shofar, in the house of his servant David, as he spoke by the mouth of his holy prophets from old, that we should be saved from our enemies, from the hand of all who hate us. Notice here, this is very, very nationalistic. Okay, this is not about, all sinners from all the Gentiles has come around and be saved. Well, no, this first and foremost has to involve a vindication of God's historic people. The New Testament stands on the Old Testament. Never forget that. If you forget that, you're going to end up distorting the message. The question is only how severely you will distort it. Okay, so keep in mind, this is going to be first and foremost something that has to happen with Israel. It has to vindicate the historic people of God before we can talk about bringing the new people in. Verse 72, to perform the mercy he promised to our fathers, the oath which he swore to our father Abraham, to grant us that we, being delivered from the hand of all our enemies, might serve him without fear, in holiness and righteousness before him all the days of our life. Okay, so again, Abrahamic promises, oath. This goes back to Genesis 22 in the Akedah, as well as Genesis 12, as well as Genesis 15. All of these things are kind of in the background here. The Holy Covenant, making good on all of his promises, delivering Israel from our enemies. We want to spiritualize this to say, well, the enemies are just sin and death. And yeah, that's going to come up here too, but it's also the Romans. It's also false brethren within the community. This is partly here and now, but partly spiritual. Okay? Make sure that you understand that in the first century, Jews are looking for vindication and salvation, and this is, can involve many things, but it needs to involve, the end of the humiliation of the people by these various pagan forces, which for centuries have oppressed them. Okay? The one in which in Jesus' own day is, of course, the Roman Empire, in effect being governed out or farmed out through the reign of King Herod. Okay, so he then turns and talks to John the Baptist in this prophetic canticle, "And you, my child, will be called prophet of the Most High, for you will go before the Lord to prepare his ways." This is a reference again to Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3, in which the prophet Isaiah, in the second part of the book, is calling upon Israel to make God's ways straight and his paths neat. This idea of God sort of traveling to us is indeed a play off the old Exodus, in which God leads the people on their own journey, but now the journey is going to be at least partly understood as God now coming to us, or coming to Israel through these paths that are to be made straight. To give his people knowledge, to give knowledge of salvation to his people for the forgiveness of their sins, through the tender mercy of our God, when the dawn from on high shall break upon us, to give those who sit in darkness in the shadow of death, to give light to those who sit in darkness in the shadow of death, and to guide our feet into the way of peace. So there's so much here that we could talk about, but this idea of forgiveness of sins is, of course, very important. Forgiveness of sins is, in the Greek, is kind of a letting go of sins, a release from sins. There's aspect of aphesis can mean release or letting go. But there's also a sense in all of this of God showing mercy and God showing light and darkness. The theme of light and darkness is also a theme that comes out a lot in the prophet Isaiah. Okay, so there's so much here of programmatic prophecy in which Luke, through placing these canticles in the story, is preparing us, is in effect priming us as readers to see all the various things that Jesus, and before him, John the Baptist, are going to bring about. Okay, so those are two things I wanted to point out to you, those canticles. I also wanted to look now at the third canticle. This is also found in the infancy narrative. This is the Canticle of Simeon, or what in the Latin is called the Nunc Dimmitis, the "now you may send." This is basically what you say in the office before you go to sleep every night. Let's take a look at that. That's in Luke chapter 2, verse 29. Let's take a look at that. "Now lettest your servant depart in peace according to thy word, for mine eyes have seen the salvation which thou hast prepared in the presence of all the peoples, a light for revelation to the Gentiles, and glory to thy people Israel." Okay, so now you finally see the Gentiles finally being mentioned in all of this. But notice, it's not apart from Israel. The two kind of go hand in hand. And indeed, before anything happens to the Gentiles, things have to happen in Israel first. That's the clear order that Luke sets out for us. And indeed, he agrees with Paul, with Matthew, Mark, and John. And in fact, all the New Testament writers agree with this, that salvation in some way has to come to Israel before it can go anywhere else. Okay, this is key. And again, this is programmatic prophecy as well. That Simeon, through his own little prophetic canticle, is preparing us for the basic pattern of salvation that's going to happen, not only in the Gospel of Luke, but in the book of Acts. Now, Simeon goes on here, and he looks at Mary, and he says in verse 34, "Behold, this child is set for the fall and the rising of many in Israel, for a sign that is spoken against, and a sword will pierce through your own heart also, that the thoughts out of many hearts may be revealed." So again, there's a lot of topsy-turvy in this. People are going to rise, people are going to fall. Ultimately, the career of this Messiah figure is going to be what's decisive. So again, This is very Jewish. This is very grounded in Old Testament expectations. And indeed, there's two places I want to bring to your attention to, even before this, where Simeon is, of course, the high priest in the temple, and he's there in the temple waiting for Jesus to be presented before him. But notice what it says about Simeon way back in verse 25. In chapter 2, verse 25, when they're going to present Jesus in the temple, we're told that there was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon, and this man was righteous and devout, looking for the consolation of Israel. Okay, this idea of looking for, waiting for is actually probably a better translation. What's this consolation of Israel we're talking about? Well, it's the whole restoration that we've kind of put together from our study of the prophets last week. It's God ultimately restoring his kingdom, and through his kingdom, through a Davidic Messiah figure. It's about God rechristening, re-sanctifying, reconstituting the temple. It's about this light to the Gentiles that's going to come out. In effect, all of this great act of salvation is going to be visible to the whole world. Okay, it's about ultimately the internal aspect of it too, people returning to God, people returning either physically to Zion, or in many cases, at least returning the hearts to God through this act of repentance. So all of these things are kind of aspects of this great restoration, which all the Jews in the first century in various ways are expecting. Okay, so again, notice he's waiting for this consolation here. Okay, and the same thing, after the presentation in the temple, you see this little sidebar about this prophetess named Anna, who is from the tribe of Asher. I wonder why that detail is mentioned. We'll have to have you think about that one later. But she's living a great age, having lived with her husband 7 years from her virginity. And now she's a widow, 84 years old, and she's constantly praying in the temple. What's she expecting here? Why is she there? Well, coming up that very hour, she gave thanks. This is chapter 2, verse 38. To God, and spoke to him of all those who were, again, looking for, it's the same word as before, waiting for. They're waiting for, in this case, the redemption of Jerusalem. Okay? This whole idea of salvation being very Jerusalem-centric is kind of the tradition of Zion, which we talked about as well. The Abrahamic promise, after you kind of lay onto that, the promise of David and this eternal kingdom centered in Jerusalem with a temple. This is a kind of an aspect that overlays onto the Abrahamic promise that just as God is going to give land as a perpetual inheritance to people, ultimately the land is now to include this kingdom centered in Jerusalem. Okay, so these are just a few things I wanted to point out in this readings, and I think perhaps we should look briefly at the temptation narrative of Jesus, and this is in chapter 4. Luke's temptation, as you'll notice, is actually very, very similar to the temptation narrative as described in Matthew. In fact, it's almost word for word the same, except that the order of the temptations are reversed. And I could leave it to you to speculate on why Luke has chosen to order his temptations that way. But what I want to focus on are just two aspects which you may not notice. You're very familiar with this story, but every time the devil tempts him, and there are actually three temptations in this, every time the devil tempts him, he quotes what? Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy. Why does he quote Deuteronomy? Well, again, if you remember the Old Testament background, Deuteronomy is in effect the yoke around Israel's neck. It's the one thing that Israel could not quite escape from. The various curses of Deuteronomy and being weighed down throughout salvation history with the weight of the continued disobedience from one generation to the next of this particular covenant. Well, in this case, Jesus Christ, who is already been revealed to us as Israel's Messiah, is now in effect doing what? He's responding to these temptations exactly the way Israel should have done in the Old Testament, but didn't do. And that's what is meant by the quotation of Deuteronomy. He's in effect, as Irenaeus would put it, he's recapitulating the story. He's acting, in effect, as the new Israel, doing what the old Israel should have done, but didn't do. And now he's done it. Okay, and this is Luke's way of telling us how Jesus is going to, through his own person, and maybe already has in some ways, taken away the burden of this sin of Deuteronomy. Okay, now, there's another aspect of this I want to bring out as well. At the very end of the temptation, Luke has the devil going away, and it says, this is chapter 4, verse 13, it says, when the devil had ended every temptation, he departed from him until an opportune time. Now, it'd be good to think about when the devil comes back again, because this is important in Luke's gospel. This temptation just kind of breaks for a little hiatus, and it's going to resume later. There is a good bit of Satanology, if I can use that term, in Luke's gospel, and this is one of the places in which you see it here. Okay, well, that's probably enough for right now. Let's go ahead and stop, and I will see you later.